It has been said that egotism and greed is the anesthetic that nature gives us to deaden the pain of being a fool. And there's truth to that. Spoken in every tongue in every corner of the globe and documented at every period in human history, our greed and ego has caused wars to be waged. Civilizations have crumbled. Families and relationships have been torn to shreds, and greatness has been stopped cold in its tracks, all because of one simple concept that we as a species continually seem to struggle with, and that is, why can't we seem to get along with one another? In the world of motorsports, there may not be another egotistical, greedy, manipulative, despicable, backstabbing story than that of two German brothers who would rise from the ashes of a post-war Germany and create the most dominant off-road motorcycle brand in existence. And in 1981, they would create a masterpiece of engineering that was so sophisticated and advanced at the time that the geometry that they created for off-road use is still used today in the motorcycles that you buy. A machine that would be so flawless in every way that Japanese manufacturers like Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki would be so discomposed over its dominance they couldn't help themselves from buying one just for the sole purpose of dismantling it to figure out how in the hell could somebody build a bike so good. But in spite of being the most prestigious off-road brand on earth and selling more than 60% of all off-road machines, an eternal feud between the two brothers would erupt with the violence of Mount Tambora, and the feud would become so dark it would turn family against family and brother against brother. This is the story of how Otto and Wilhelm Maisch created the most iconic European motorcycle brand of its time, Maico, only to allow their ego and greed to crumble their empire like the walls of Jericho, transforming them from legends to lepers overnight. It's a sad tale of how the two brothers could somehow survive the most vile political regime in history, but couldn't survive each other. This is the bizarre story of how Otto and Wilhelm Maisch internally sabotaged the Maico brand and the greatest dirt bike that has ever been built, the 1981 Maico 490 Mega 2. In 1946, two German brothers, Otto and Wilhelm Maisch, sit in a huge warehouse 50 kilometers south of Stuttgart, Germany, in a town called Pfaffingen. They've spent the last decade of their lives under the control of the most horrendous and vile regime known to mankind. And just like the other German manufacturers at the time, BMW, Porsche, and Mercedes, they've been forced over the last several years to hemorrhage all of their resources to support the war effort. And now that World War II has ended, they're left with a country that's in shambles. The economy is broken. The cities have been reduced to rubble and left uninhabitable. And millions of people have been left homeless, wandering aimlessly around the country with nothing more than the clothes on their back. And they're all asking themselves the same question: what in the hell do we do now? And for the Maisch brothers, they would go with what they know. You see, prior to the war, they worked for their father Ulrich in his automobile business that was called Maisch & Company. They provided 24-hour automobile service and sold bicycle and motorcycle parts. And in 1935, the Maisch brothers actually did build their very first complete motorcycle. Now, at that time, it was nothing more than just a bicycle frame powered by a small engine, but that was their first motorcycle. Now, after tinkering with many ideas post-war, the two brothers decide that the path of least resistance would be to fulfill the dire basic transportation needs of a country that's trying to rebuild itself. So they refocused all of their attention back to the development and production of motorcycles. And somewhere along the line here, they decided to shorten the name of Maisch & Company to Maico. So in 1949, they would release the Maico M150. It was a durable and affordable mule of a machine, and it was just what Deutschland needed at the time. Now, as the 1950s roll around, the European economy starts to pick up, and Maico begins to thrive. They added an M175 and M250 to the popular M150 motorcycle. They produced a scooter that was called the Maico Mobile, and they even took a shot at building a car with a Heinkel engine that looked a lot like a Volkswagen Beetle. Soon they would find themselves again crossing paths with the German government, albeit this time under better circumstances, as they would be commissioned to produce 10,000 dual-sport motorcycles for the German army. This invariably shifted the company's focus towards off-road and competition motorcycles that would pay huge dividends for Maico in the future. Now, by the mid-1950s, Maico is a highly profitable and dominant European brand, and everything from the outside looks perfect, but it's not. Because behind the scenes, the two brothers Otto and Wilhelm are locked in a soap opera-style conflict. Now, history remains skewed on the exact origins of the conflict, but it's deep, it's dark, and it's very dirty. Now, in an attempt to throw some darts toward a conclusion for the sake of this video, one could speculate that maybe it was political, as Wilhelm had been a member of the National Socialist Party and Otto was not. However, this might have just been something they did intentionally to hedge the company's future by playing both sides of an unknown outcome. Or maybe it was just greed, bitterness, and control. Because due to Wilhelm's party involvement, he was not eligible to be a majority owner of Maico. So this gave Otto 60% control of the company and 40% went to Wilhelm. Nonetheless, this conflict would escalate in 1957, when Wilhelm would be struck by a motorcycle and become paralyzed. Now, it's unclear if he was hit by a Maico, but after this accident, he became nothing more than a figurehead for the company. This left 100% of the day-to-day operation in the hands of Otto. So Wilhelm decides to bring on his three sons, Hans, Peter, and Wilhelm Jr., to work for the company, but also to act as his eyes and ears on the day-to-day operations of Maico. Now, his son Hans was a motocross rider, so he was put in charge of developing the machines for Maico. Peter would be placed in administration and was also in charge of media and press, and Wilhelm Jr., who had some engineering skills, was put in charge of all technical development and production of Maico motorcycles. Now, even though there is some serious bad blood going on behind the scenes and some very deep wounds that will be burst open in the future, somehow throughout the 1960s, they're able to set aside their differences and continue to grow and thrive. And soon, Maico would find themselves smack dab in the middle of a gold mine. Because as we move into the 1960s, America's experiencing a period of sustained economic growth, and the fruits of prosperity are everywhere. Dirt bikes are now becoming wildly popular. Motorcycles are no longer seen as transportation vessels, but luxury items. However, back then, there weren't many purpose-built motorcycles for off-road use. So what riders would do is take street bikes, throw on some knobby tires, and start going off-road. This is what gave birth to what we know as scramblers. At this point in history, the Japanese manufacturers like Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Suzuki are behind the curve when it comes to off-road development. So the only ones that were specializing in purpose-built off-road machines were European companies like CZ, Husqvarna, and Maico. And this is where Maico had an extreme advantage that no one else would be able to match for the next 15 years, and that was in chassis and geometry technology. Whether they learned this from building war machines for the Germans or by luck, nothing came close to the handling off-road like a Maico. This perfection obviously translated into sales, and dealers couldn't keep these motorcycles in stock, and Maico couldn't build them fast enough. Now, on a side note, these were the good old days where like a 400cc Maico sold for about $1,100 new. That's like $5,500 today. I mean, could you imagine buying a new dirt bike today for $5,000? Anyway, this would culminate in 1981, when Maico would produce what many people feel today was the greatest dirt bike, not only of its era, but the greatest dirt bike that has ever been built. And that would be the 1981 Maico 490 Mega 2. So what makes the 1981 Maico 490 so special? Well, in one word, everything. I don't have to be the one to tell you that a 490cc two-stroke engine is fast, but the Maico 490 was ludicrous fast. It pumped out more than 45 horsepower and weighed around 240 pounds. And these are some very astonishing numbers by 1980 standards. The bike was so potent that magazine testers described the power as a rush of acceleration that curls your socks up and down like a flapping window shade, or it has all the subtlety of a safe falling on a cricket, or all of the finesse of a cannon being fired in a handball court. But power itself is nothing without control. And while the Maico 490 was a beast in the power department, it was also very manageable. No burbles in the engine, no ignition timing issue, no brutal hits followed by huge power drop-offs. The Maico 490's power was crisp and clean. And when you take that engine and you put it in an amazing chassis, you have an unbeatable motorcycle. The handling of the Maico 490 was razor sharp. The brakes would stop on a dime and give you 9 cents change. In fact, the magazine testers were so impressed by the motorcycle, they swore that Maico was giving the media works machines to test for reviews. So Maico allowed any magazine the right to break down the bike that was given to them and verify if it was stock or works. And that's exactly what the magazines did. They tore all of the machines down, and guess what? They were stock. But all the mystique of the 490 doesn't stop there. This bike was so good that Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki bought one, had their engineers dissect the machine into pieces to figure out how did they build such a motorcycle, and still after tearing the thing down, the best engineers in the world couldn't figure out why this bike was so damn good. And since that time, magazines have constantly used that 1981 Maico 490 as a benchmark to measure other late model dirt bikes. And if you cut and paste the geometry of the 81 Maico 490, it's not that far off of a modern day dirt bike. So anybody that wanted the best out-of-the-box off-road motorcycle for racing or leisure, you bought a Maico. It was that simple. And they outsold Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki in open-class machines combined. And in the late 1970s and early 80s, the off-road world belonged to Maico, but not for long. When the 1982 Maico 490 is set to be released, the hype is obviously huge. I mean, everybody is kneeling at the altar of Maico, ready to sacrifice their hard-earned dollars for one of their 1982 models. I mean, who wouldn't want one, right? It has to be faster, better, and more precise than the 81 model, right? Wrong. It was worse. And I mean perplexing, bizarre, no way in hell is this possible worse. I mean, it's not uncommon that every so often a manufacturer takes a step back when they build a new model. And while it might not be as good as the prior year, at least it's close. It's still a good bike, but not the 1982 Maico 490. The rear hubs that were installed on the bike suddenly start disintegrating. The gearboxes start exploding like popcorn. The bike gains more than 20 pounds, and the rear shock shaft would break every 2 to 3 rides. The 1982 bike wasn't anywhere close to the 1981. It's as if this bike was assembled by a high school vocational class using scrap parts. I mean, Maico literally went from building the greatest dirt bike ever in 1981 to building the worst dirt bike ever in 1992. How is that even possible? Well, for starters, the 1982 model had a single shock concept. And rather than use a tried and true rear shock manufacturer, they used the Italian Corte and Coso shock. Now, they had a lot of experience with cars, but very little experience for motorcycles. But Maico said they chose the Corte and Coso shock because it kept the costs lower. So that's not such a big deal. The big deal was that all of the shocks were the wrong length. And where the top mounted to the frame and the bottom mounted to the swing arm, those 2 points didn't line up straight. So when you rode the bike, the suspension would push to one side or the other, and over time, it would either bend or worse, it would break. It was so bad that company memos state that the shocks had to be hammered into their mounting points with large hammers at the factory. Also, the gearboxes on the 1982 model were not heat treated properly from the factory, so they just started blowing to pieces randomly. But the worst issue that they had was the rear hubs on the bike would fail constantly, causing significant injuries to riders. In a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation, Otto Maisch directs that new Öhlin shocks be supplied free of charge under warranty with proper spacers to allow them to work. Now, these Öhlin shocks cost twice as much as the Corte Coso units, but it's the only thing they can do at this point to salvage this terrible situation. He would also warranty the cases and begin to replace the faulty hubs. At least he was trying to make good on his warranty claims. But at the time, no one could understand how such a bizarre thing could happen. But hey, everybody makes mistakes, right? And the motorcycle public was willing to give Maico a second chance. So the pressure was on in 1983 to right the wrongs of 1982 and restore the brand to greatness it once enjoyed. With all of Maico's 40-plus years of experience in off-road development, their highly educated engineers, they have to be able to rise to the occasion. No way could they survive another disastrous money-hemorrhaging year like 1982. Even Otto Maisch put the pressure on the factory and Wilhelm Jr. to make the 1983 Maico an iconic once-in-a-generation model. It couldn't just be good. It had to be great. So for sure they were going to rise to the occasion and knock the 1983 model out of the park, right? Wrong again. Because the 1983 model had more rear hub failures, more gearbox grenading, and even though they switched to the Öhlin shock, it didn't help the bike. It got so bad that the term Maico Breako was coined to describe these motorcycles. And with all the malfunctions of the bikes, lawsuits start piling in. And the final stake would be driven through the heart of Maico when American racer David Dion Scott would be paralyzed when his rear hub failed. His lawsuit would halt further importation of the bikes, and U.S. dealers were sending back all the motorcycles they received. They were doing everything they could to distance themselves from the pariah of the motorsports world, Maico. And before 1983 was over, 2 years after sitting atop the off-road empire by building the greatest motorcycle of all time, and after obliterating its competition in sales and becoming the most dominant sought-after brand in existence, Maico would file for bankruptcy. But the question is how on earth can you fall from grace so fast? How could you repeat the same mistakes in 1983 as you did in 1982? You can't be that stupid. I mean, you have to work real hard to screw up that much. It's like a joke or something, like you're doing this on purpose, but that's not possible, is it? That's just a conspiracy theory, right? Well, remember that feud we talked about earlier? Apparently, the feud between Otto, Wilhelm, and his sons has reached an epic boiling point, and perhaps all of this engineering disaster was purposely orchestrated to tank the brand. This story is about to get wild. Obviously, one of the downfalls of the 1982 model was the rear Corte and Coso shock. While a great shock for cars, Corte and Coso had little motorcycling experience and, quite frankly, made garbage shocks. So who approved the Corte and Coso rear shocks? Well, that would be the technical director, Wilhelm Jr. Now, at the time, Wilhelm Jr. blames it on Corte and Coso, but the engineers over at Öhlin says no shock would have survived with the system designed the way that it was. So this isn't all on Corte and Coso. Anyway, that's just the rear suspension. What about those grenading gearboxes? Well, it turns out that the material that was being used was improperly hardened during production, therefore becoming faulty. So would you like to take a guess on who is in charge of building those engine cases? Yes, Wilhelm Maisch Jr. In fact, in an internal company memo, Wilhelm Jr. admits that his department had used the wrong material in the gearboxes. So I guess at this point it would be no surprise to wonder who is in charge of developing those faulty rear hubs and the materials that were used to build them. Yes, Wilhelm Maisch Jr. Okay, well, let's not be judgmental here. I mean, maybe the guy's just terrible at picking out parts. But in 1981, an inebriated Wilhelm Maisch Jr. and his brother Peter were attending a family Christmas party, and they bragged to the attendees that soon the two Maisch families would no longer be friends and Otto was going to be pissed. Okay, well, sometimes people say some dumb stuff when they're intoxicated. But again, in 1981, Maico needed to borrow money to put more development into the single shock design. But Wilhelm Maisch and his family refused to co-sign on a loan. They refused to put up their company's share of collateral to secure that loan. And in a desperate attempt to save the company at the time, Otto decides to put up his entire company's share and his personal share of wealth and fortune to secure the loan. That's weird, but maybe the Wilhelm family just doesn't want to take the risk at the time. Anyway, shortly thereafter, a memo is discovered from a tax consultant that was written to the Maisch brothers. It's a step-by-step blueprint telling them the exact steps they need to take to put Maico into bankruptcy and then how to execute a takeover bid once they went bankrupt. Okay, that's enough. Something suspicious is going on here. Now let's go back to Otto. He would not only need a loan from the bank to help save Maico, but he would call on two distributors by the name of Brian Gross and Van Dijk, who agreed to throw a lifeline to Maico. But the terms of these loans, as well as the requests from other distributors worldwide, was that if you want us to continue to do business with you and help you out, you've got to get rid of the Wilhelm brothers. So obviously everybody in the industry could see what was happening. And the only conclusion I can draw at this time is Otto knew this, but somehow kept putting his family first. He kept putting his fortunes on the line and taking incredible risks, even though he knew that his family was out to get him. And that's sad. Anyway, at this time, Otto has no choice. It's Maico or the family. So in December of 1982, the Maisch brothers are dismissed from Maico. So what do you think happens next? Do the Maisch brothers wander off into obscurity and let Otto have the company? Yeah, I didn't think so. After their dismissal, the Maisch brothers go after Otto by launching a smear campaign throughout Europe in the press. And the most damaging was a malicious article that appeared in an English magazine. It was so bad that it instantly cratered Maico's sales overnight. And then later a British importer would be quoted as saying that the article was written by a journalist who was very close friends with Peter Maisch. But now with the poor sales of the 1983 model, Otto desperately tried to borrow money and warrantied all of the damaged bikes, but when the banks saw the stories in the press, they just slammed the door on him, and they wouldn't loan him any money. And again, at this point, Otto has no choice. If he wants to save the company, he now has to use his own money. And that's exactly what he would do. And soon he would deplete his entire life savings in an attempt to save Maico. But by this time, the damage from internal sabotage had been done. The brand's name is trash, and lawsuits continue to pile in. Rider injuries keep stacking up. And after several years of pouring his blood, sweat, and personal finances into saving his beloved company, Otto has to capitulate. And on May 10th of 1983, Maico and Otto Maisch would be forced to declare bankruptcy. And like the vultures that they are, the Maisch brothers would swoon in and take control of Maico, and a company that once did $23 million in sales was purchased for the bargain basement price of 100,000 United States dollars. I'll be damned. However, in an act of poetic justice or karma, while the Maisch brothers achieved their goal in acquiring Maico, somehow Otto and his daughter owned the U.S. headquarters. And this was huge, because without the United States market, the Maisch brothers were toast. And in spite of their best efforts, they could never wrestle away control from Otto and his daughter. Now, the Maisch brothers would attempt to power through the mid-1980s by importing Maicos to America under the M-Star name. But by that time, the motorcycling public and the distributorships had banished the Maico brand into the bowels of hell. And a few years later, the Maisch brothers would relinquish their control of Maico to an outside buyer. Since then, the brand has changed hands many times, but in spite of best efforts, nobody's been able to restore Maico to the greatness it once was. Now, I didn't mention racing too much because also, in spite of having a great bike and great riders like Danny Magoo Chandler, somehow they were never able to translate that into success under the works rules in the professional series. Eventually, Otto and Wilhelm would pass away, and they would be buried under a pile of animosity and regret. Now, I read somewhere that Wilhelm Jr. would end up in a psychiatric facility for a short period of time, and the brothers would bounce in and out of the motorsports industry, but they would never be able to create anything close to what Maico was. And as the saying goes, your true enemy is never a stranger. It's always someone you know. And nothing could be more truthful when it comes to the Maisches. Now, in doing this video, there were two things that stood out more than anything else. One is, as a greedy fan, I couldn't help but think of what could have been. If they could have set aside their differences, would Maico be right there today alongside the likes of Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki, and KTM? I mean, we'll never know, but it seems like such a waste. And the second would obviously be the level of hatred and sabotage between the families. I mean, the lengths they would go through for greed and power is just not mind-boggling, it's evil. They purposely built dangerous motorcycles to tank the brand, but those engineering flaws seriously injured innocent riders who trusted them, and that's the worst sin. And I somehow can't wrap my head around the fact that these two brothers could survive while the entire world was at war, at one of the worst times in world history, but yet they couldn't survive each other. I once heard that blood doesn't make you family. What makes you family is loyalty, trust, respect, and unity. And for the Maisches, I guess they never really were family, were they? They were just related. Thanks for watching. Tschüss.